All right, Matt. Well, we've just lost your brother, so it's just the two of us. We'll see if we can carry the show right here.
Okay.
And I want to tell you something, Matt.
Yeah.
Rock and roll.
Yeah.
It never forgets. And you know how I know? Because Bob Seger told me on the 1976 album Night Moves. So before we get into our take, okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Do you think that sometimes rock and roll would like to forget, but it just can't?
Oh, I think yes, it would. Yeah. I also think that rock and roll never forgets is a common theme of Seger albums, which is that somehow rock and roll is someone is out to get rock and roll, but rock and roll always comes back. At Old Time Rock and Roll would be another song that covers that ground on later albums, stuff like that. So, but before we get into that talk, Matt, why don't you run the numbers for us?
So the numbers: Bob Seger and the Silver Bullet Band. Let's be specific here. This is their album Night Moves, and it ranks in the 1970s on Best Ever Albums at 541 of the decade, number 52 in 1976 when it was released, and 2,931 of all time. It is Bob Seger and the Silver Bullet Band's second highest rated album, behind Stranger in Town, on Best Ever Albums, but it's by far the best album cover that I've seen in this entire podcast. So
why don't you tell the viewers a little bit about what this album cover looks like?
The album is Night Moves, so of course you got a close up of Bob Seger, and next to him is a full moon. And he's got long flowing hair, a scraggly, unkempt beard, and he's just got this. His head is tilted up in I don't even know how you would describe his face. I don't know.
Orgasmic, I would say.
Passionate, orgasmic, pensive. But he seems like he has all of the answers to all of the questions in the universe.
At least about rock and roll.
Yes. So, John, this was you picked this album to cover.
So
why did you do that?
So here's the deal. Last week I picked I broke my rules and I picked two bands that were under the radar a little bit because I thought, it'd be kind of fun to pick some long lost bands that no one ever knew about.
And which one was again? You did the Ash. What is it? The Blue Ash.
Blue Ash.
Yeah. And what was your other one that you did?
Was one of the ones, and then I did UFO.
UFO. Okay.
All right. And so I picked some under the radar ones, but normally my role on the podcast is I've been filling in some of the albums on those coldness and hot takes that I've described them. I think Frampton was the last one we did. I'm like, you can't tell the story of the 70s without these artists, right? And so I was looking at who haven't we covered that you really can't tell the story of the 70s without covering them. And, you added Warren Zevon, which I thought was a nice one to that. But Bob Seger and Steve Miller Band popped out to me right away because between the two of them, they sold 19 jillion copies, I think, of their albums. And there are still people who will play their greatest hits or the albums they remember across, and people are always discovering their music to this day. They're two artists that still, even if you're born now, you stumble into these songs and people listen to them. And that's how I picked these two, if you're wondering. So, and in the case of both, I wanted to pick their albums that are, if not the most commercially successful, have sort of been listed as the prototypical sound of the band, if that makes sense. Steve Miller is harder because there's different eras of it, but this is kind of like the straight Seger, so that's how I got to it.
Got it. Okay.
So, I kind of know where I fit on this, and I'll give my spiel in a little bit, but Matt, what were your thoughts on Night Moves?
Mixed. Okay. I think I would probably say I think I liked it better than I thought I would. Bob Seger's a guy who, an artist that I've known of for many, many years. Obviously know his hits, something like Against the Wind, Old Time Rock and Roll,
Turn the Page.
Oh, there's a funny story about that. I told Sherry I would tell you about it, but she used to have a roommate. She was in a house years ago, and she had two roommates, and one of them was a guy who every morning, as he got up, he would play Turn the Page. Every morning.
That's a stark way to wake up every morning.
And she would be like, she's like, every morning I just hear Turn the Page coming.
Would she hear that whining like,
yeah,
and then,
the whole thing.
On alone on some highway.
Yeah, he played the whole thing.
Okay.
It was like
East of Omaha.
Yeah, it's like wake up, eat breakfast, we'll turn the page, and it's just something that he liked to do. So I thought that was kind of funny. So knew a lot of these songs. Hated. He does Like a Rock, right?
He does.
Yeah. Okay. So remember that I think I first started hating Bob Seger when I heard all those Chevy commercials that were.
I don't think anybody was hurt more by the commercialization of his music than Bob Seger. whether it be in movies overusing it or commercials. Yeah.
Yes, it is. He is certainly an overplayed artist, I would say, and I think that certainly contributed to my dislike or dismissal. Probably is a better way to say it, because it was just like, why is this such a popular song? It's fine, but it's so not as good as all this press is, making it out to be, or all this, this play that he's getting. So having said that, I knew a couple of songs on here. I knew Night Moves. I knew, was that it? No, there was another one in here that I think I might have heard before. I'll think of it in a second.
You probably knew Rock and Roll Never Forgets. That's a pretty big hit.
Yeah, actually, that didn't really stand out. I didn't really know many of the songs on here, to be honest. Main Street. That was the other one that I was like, I heard the beginning. I'm like, I might have heard this before. So my overall take, I prefer Bob Seger when he doesn't go full on rock and roll. When Bob Seger goes full on rock and roll, you talked last week about, I think it was Blue Ash that you were talking about. It was just this blues band in a bar that's like, so people drinking like, pony beers and stuff like that.
Yep.
Because that's what I thought of when I hear Bob Seger do rock and roll.
This is the act you wanted to hear instead of Blue Ash when you were at the local bar.
And I didn't really listen to the full Blue. I think I listened to maybe one or two tracks. But to me, this is kind of like, and I think Josh put it when because he gave us some takes, and he was like, "This is a poor man's Springsteen," and I kind of see that.
I disagree with that completely, but I'll get there.
Okay, so but to me, it's fine rock and roll. I will say I do like his voice a lot. He's got a great rock and roll voice, and I'm sure that this guy puts on a hell of a show. He's got that music, and he seems like the album cover shows. He's probably got that swagger of like a really good performer. So I'm sure, and I totally get why people like him. And I know people, I think he's a Midwestern guy, and I know he's like one of those guys that like people in the Midwest love as much as people in Jersey love Springsteen, right? So I know that he's a very popular artist. So the full-on rock songs like Rock and Roll Never Forgets or Fire Down Below, it doesn't really, it's kind of generic to me. It's just like, it's a fine blues rock type style, but doesn't really, it's not what I'm looking for. I need a little bit more, I need something a little bit different. I need something a little bit more, I don't know, interesting or whatever. But I did find some of the stuff, like I always thought Night Moves is a good song. I do like the acoustic guitar, the way the piano plays in there, the chord progressions. He's got some really melodic chord progressions going on there. And the standout to me was a song I never heard of. Sunburst was a very interesting song. Mm-hmm. The beginning of that sounds like a kind of 90s alt-rock grunge type sound, almost like Alice in Chains doing like a Unplugged type song. I thought that was interesting. And then it goes into a totally different direction with a really cool guitar riff and then a flute solo at the end. So that song in particular kind of stood out as being like, wow, I wasn't expecting that seemed to kind of go in a different direction. And I liked a song like that a lot more actually than kind of the more straight up rock and roll songs. Ship of Fools was an interesting song. That's kind of like a straight up country song, which I thought was kind of interesting. And Come to Papa I thought that was a really cool riff. That to me was that was more of a rock song that was done better and a little bit more interesting than like something like Rock and Roll Never Forgets. So it's a little bit mixed. There was some stuff that I found in here that I did like. There was some stuff that I heard in here that made me go, oh yeah, Bob Seger, not really doing it a whole lot for me. So it'd be interesting to see how I would feel on subsequent listens. Do those other songs still bother me as much as they do, or would the songs that I found more interesting, would they hold water through the test of time? But he's certainly, I can see why you picked him. I know he is a huge artist that, like I said, that people love Bob Seger. Never really did it for me. This kind of inched the needle a little bit more up towards the positive for me. So I'm glad about that. And I was interested to hear him do different things, because I think that some of the stuff on here is way better than the commercialization, like the Like a Rock and the old time rock and roll stuff that you just hear over and over again ad nauseum. So a little bit thumbs in the middle, pointing up. I'd say a little bit higher. So,
yeah. Here's my take on Bob Seger, and I picked this album with a little bit of a. This is kind of like when I picked the Monkees, Matt. Where my take on Bob Seger is that somehow it became a rite of passage for people that were serious about music to hate Bob Seger because you got narratives, right? One of which is, oh, he's a poor man's Bruce Springsteen, or oh, all of his stuff is commercial and he does stuff. And I call him proletariat rock. He makes rock and roll music that sounds great and that sounds like other music that you do like, and sounds like other music you liked later as well, that if it wasn't Bob Seger, you would like more. But because he does not try to be cool or play to you, you as a serious, and I use that in quotes, music fan, there are some people that write him off. And what happens is they trip over themselves to talk about how much they, how non-essential he is, despite the fact that, there's generations of people that like his music. And it's funny because you normally never hear anyone say, well, it's not like, that he's bad, right? It's just they can't say why. It's just that I don't think he's cool because he doesn't insert name of what you don't like about him. He's too commercial. He's music for people that aren't like me, i.e. like smart people who listen to music and find narratives and write pieces in Pitchfork and The Ringer and, adjacent Rolling Stone stuff. And I don't mean to sound overly harsh, but I feel like because of that, he gets kind of put into the not essential category. But like, this is the sound of mainstream good rock and roll in the 1970s. There's not a bad song on this album. It's varied. It is not just one. I think another thing you hear people, all Bob Seger songs sound the same. False. No. And this album is, he ends with like a Mary Lou sounds nothing like what I think people would think of. He's going back to like nostalgia rock to some degree, which is another knock that people give Seger. And you know me, I don't love nostalgia, but to me, he's more of an homage than a yearning for. Yeah. I'll correct you. Night Moves is not just a good song. It's a great song. It's freaking fantastic in terms of the composition and lyrically. It's awesome. Yeah. Main Street is a fantastic song. If you want a straight ahead, rock and roll Chuck Berry-esque like type song, Rock and Roll Never Forgets is that song at the beginning, so you can't dislike that. You mentioned in Sunburst a lot of things that I would say too. I was gonna say, and you mentioned Blue Ash, Matt, I said this is the band that you wanted to go to your local bar and hear, but this is the best local bar Midwestern band that you could make. Yeah. With the guy with the great rock and roll voice, the tight sound behind it, and the songs to go along with it. And you just know that this band could do these 9 tracks and then bang off 3 covers and go for, and Mary Lou is a cover, but it could do sort of the first 8 songs, then do Mary Lou and 2 other covers, and there you go. You've got a good night while you're drinking your Labatt Blue or your Bush Pounders at the bar, right? Yeah. And one of the wonderful things about Time, Matt, is that stuff that is pretty good but doesn't get its due, you give it enough time and the people weren't around to shit on it who were there, and slowly people start to listen to it without the stigma, and time goes on and time goes on, and suddenly you hear stuff like Jack White go, I love Bob Seger. Yeah. In fact, my favorite song is a Bob Seger song. Yeah. 2 + 2 =, which is, another era of Bob Seger. But you start to hear that, and then suddenly serious rock and roll people are forced to have to then look at it, but they still can't quite go all the way. I think what's also interesting about this, Matt, is in its time, this was actually reviewed very well by serious rock critics. It was a 4-star album in Rolling Stones. Robert Christgau gave it an A. So there's, in its time, it was well considered. But like I said, I think what hurt Bob Seger was he was one of the first guys to commercialize his music, and people just got tired of hearing Like a Rock, and they watched, what was the Risky Business, old time rock and roll and stuff, and it's like he was like a meme, he became a meme. Yeah. And this was my attempt to unmeme Bob Seger and say, listen to this album, because I've listened to this album before, and I think there's a lot to do this. I think it's similar to Pisces, Aquarius, Capricorn, and Jones Limited for the Monkees, where you can listen to it and see that they really did do a lot of stuff, and they're better than you think. It's not transcendent, but it certainly doesn't deserve to be in the dustbin of history either.
No, and I think that's what I was surprised, because I was expecting to get a lot of the same stuff, and I was surprised.
Well, because Matt, you're a bourgeoisie member of the music intelligentsia.
I am. I'm very much yes. And
I'm a proletariat guy.
My reviews all look like that too. When I do all my writing and stuff. But no, you're right, because it all came from like he's so ubiquitous in so many scenes for like that, for the licensing of his music. And it's just, and yes, and I was very sick of that Chevy commercial in particular. I think I think he had that song.
I don't disagree with you on that,
licensed
by
to
the way.
Chevy for, I'm serious, it was like 10 years. I couldn't believe every football game I'd watch. It was like, and it came on every other commercial. It was just like, I hate this, and I hate
Well, and
Chevy,
they always played
and
the most passionate part of it too, which was which was out of context, made it even worse, right?
No, it was really bad. So, but no, this is. I see all the things that you're saying. To me, Bob Seger was never somebody that I outright was just like, oh, I hate him. We're going to cover somebody in a second that I've said that about. But he's kind of just been. He was either just there, or it's just somebody that I just had no interest in exploring the catalog, and that was mostly because of the.
It's not cool to say you like Bob Seger, Matt. I think that's part of it.
Yeah, but
it's cool to say you like Bruce Springsteen.
But
it's not cool to
but
say you
here's
like
the
Bob
thing.
Seger.
I didn't know. It wasn't even about that. It was about like I didn't know anybody that really liked Bob Seger, right? So Mike never gave me a Bob Seger. My uncles never, my parents, my friends, nobody was ever like, oh, you got to listen to this. You know what I mean? So it was one of those things that I was never exposed to. And the stuff that I was exposed to, I was overexposed to and didn't really care for all that much. So then I was like, okay, I know who this guy is. I'm fine, right? If those are his best songs, the most popular songs, then what else am I going to get out of it? So that's partially on me for just being totally dismissive and not, exploring more on my own. But I will say that when I heard, I was surprised, at the variety and the stuff that I did like, and the kind of almost in some ways forward thinking some of this stuff was, in particular that Sunburst. That Sunburst song was fantastic. I was really surprised by that, and so yeah. So
that's
I
actually
think,
one of the 2 tracks I picked for the Spotify playlist. So
oh,
we're
really?
on the same page. That and Night Moves. Yeah,
it was very surprising. I was like, I had no idea that he did stuff like that. So all the more reason to actually, and that's what's one of the great things about not just the podcast, but also about Spotify, is that you're able to just, I don't have to go out and buy a Bob Seger album, right? And roll the dice with that and spend, $18 or whatever on a CD. You can just, listen to it and say, oh, I can appreciate some of the things on here that I would not have known otherwise. Why aren't some of these songs more popular? Why isn't he licensing some of these other songs that are more interesting than some of the straight up rock that he's doing? But but that's for another thing. But yeah.
Well, it's funny you say no one who liked it, because as someone who went to college in the Midwest, Michigan specifically, I knew lots of people who liked Bob Seger, and their parents and their aunts and their uncles, and you would often go to a certain type of bar, and Turn the Page would close the night, right? Or Against the Wind would close the night. So, and I'm a Jersey guy, and I would go so far as to say, in many ways, I connect more with the nostalgia music of Bob Seger than I do with the nostalgia music of Bruce Springsteen, to be quite honest. So hot take there. Yep.
There you go. Yeah, no, I like Springsteen way more, but I also know him. I mean, this is the only Bob Seger album that I've ever listened to, and I know that he's probably got a bunch of others. So, so it's hard for me to, I've loved Springsteen for many years, and, still do. So it's going to be hard for me to flip that switch.
I think they do something different, though, because I think Springsteen comes from that Guthrie, Dylan folk tradition, and then he expanded on it, whereas this is very much like the Chuck Berry, R&B tradition of songs, like straight ahead rock songs.
Yes.
Springsteen can do that, but he's not doing that all the time. Seger always has that through line right there, and he always has like 1 or 2 ballads. That's kind of usually about like love, and often about like love as a teenager.
Yeah, I think, I kind of like his slower down, mid-tempo type songs more than his rocked out songs.
Well, that's most of his hits from the 70s.
Yeah.
That's Against the Wind, that's Turn the Page, that's Night Moves. Yeah.
And those songs those songs I didn't hear those ones as much though as like the Like a Rock or Old Time Rock and Roll. But
that's funny you say that, because Turn the Page is the one that I feel like I've heard more than any of them, even with the football.
I don't think I knew Turn the Page until Metallica did it. That was I was like, oh, that's a Bob Seger song? I didn't really, so I actually knew that as a Metallica song before Bob Seger.
I will say that you can't help but hear a little bit of Jungle Land in Night Moves for sure. So I think he even said he was influenced by Born to Run, and especially that song. So it's not an exact rewrite though. It's different.
You don't hear that song and then go, oh man, he's a total ripping off, the Jungle Land or whatever. But no, that is a good song. Pleasantly surprised. Probably somewhat along the lines of the Steely Dan, although I probably not as much because I think I outwardly said I hate Steely Dan. I don't think I ever said it about Bob Seger. Bob Seger was just kind of just there, and it was just like, well, whatever. I don't need to. I got other stuff I want to listen to than him. So so this is it was good. Maybe if I listened to it more, I'd come around more. So maybe I need to start doing that. But
I don't know if you. I think mine was basically just. I think there's a lot of people who would be listening to this who might just write off Bob Seger as, I don't like him because I don't like him because everybody else I know says I shouldn't like him. And I would just say, can you just give this a listen and make sure, if that's your narrative, that you prove it against actually listening to it. If you get there, I will not hold it against you. If you say, oh, it's too derivative, go for it. But I at least like people to make sure that they know that to be true before, listening to 3 songs and saying, I can't do Bob Seger.
Is he an artist that is, because that's the other thing too. He's not, if you look at like all the best, lists and critically, you say this was critically well regarded, but he's also not a name that really comes up in a lot of circles of the artists. It's not just the people that I know, it's the artists that I listen to. It's the people who are like, oh, you got to listen. I've always, I hear artists that I really like talk about how much everybody loves Springsteen, and that's one of the reasons I hear, I almost get inundated with hearing about certain artists that, the artists that I like, that I'm like, okay, well, maybe I need to check these people out. But Bob Seger never seems to, in my memory, come up with, from other musicians. I mean, you mentioned Jack White, but I never really, growing up or like in recent years, never really hear a whole lot of people going, man, Bob Seger is, because you know what I mean? So I think that's another reason why I might not have been gravitating towards him, because other artists really weren't, I wasn't hearing about it through that medium.
You're talking about like what artists were influenced by Bob Seger?
Or just if I'm reading an article, right? If I get an article and like, a band that I like is taught, I'm reading something about Arcade Fire, for example, whatever, right? I might hear Win Butler talk about Springsteen, but I never really heard Win Butler talk about Bob Seger. I never really heard the artists that I would read about in reviews never really talked about Bob Seger. So maybe if one of them would have been like, oh man, like if Eddie Vedder was like, man, if I read an article with him, it's like, I love Bob Seger. And he probably does actually. Like, now that I think about it, he probably is.
I don't know. I know the two most vocal Eddie, or I know that Kid Rock, obviously, and Jack White have both. Yeah, Jack White have both said that they love him. But I'll have to look into that. That might be a cleaning the stacks. I know that the Black Crowes, I think, like Bob Seger a lot too, if I remember correctly. Yeah.
So. I think that might have changed me too, not just other people, but a lot of times I might go back to an older artist because bands that I like are talking about them. So I think that's another thing. But yeah, it was a good pick, John. I'm glad you did it. I'm a little bit more interested now than I was before.
So there's an interesting story I found, by the way, when I just Googled that out of curiosity. So ready for this? I'll clean the stack right here. In last year's book, Let's Go Crazy, about the making of Purple Rain, writer Adam Light depicted this scene. One night, Prince asked Matt Fink why the proudly working-class Detroit rocker had such a huge appeal. Fink replied that it was Seger's big, gut-punching ballads, We've Got Tonight, Turn the Page, that his fans loved, and that Prince should try writing that kind of anthem if he really wanted to conquer the pop world. Nearly 2 years later, Prince's monster guitar ballad, Purple Rain, title track from the film and album, soared onto the pop, R&B, and rock charts. It's been a staple of his songs since. He thinks, well, we can't say this for sure, but he thinks that was Prince trying to write a Bob Seger song. We'll see. That seems a little bit of a stretch, but with that being said, yeah. But here is a quote from Prince. "It is especially meaningful to go into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame with Bob Seger," Prince said. "We are both Midwesterners, and Seger had a lot of influence on me at the start of my career in some songs I write. He certainly influenced my writing." So... maybe there is something to it there.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So there you go. Maybe does that push you over the edge?
Well,
Prince
it's just
co-signs there?
I'm just saying if I had heard that or read more stuff like that, in the past, I might have that would have been something that would have given me a little push to explore that a little bit more and to maybe change and be like, really,
Yeah.
maybe I should look into that. So
Gotcha.
yeah, that's all I'm saying.
Well, so my parting shot here, if you haven't listened to Bob Seger, do this and make sure you prove it. And if you're one of our younger listeners and like you've heard of Bob Seger, but you haven't really checked it out, do at least check out Night Moves, Turn the Page, and Against the Wind, so that if all you're getting is old time rock and roll and like a rock and stuff is what you're saying, at least listen to his hits that are not, so... Well, but if you didn't grow up listening to those Chevy commercials, maybe you have a different take on. So who knows? So anyway, we've covered that quite a bit.